me and all of the people that I work with the charity Their World. This is very squeaky, sure I'm alright, am I in there? Okay, that one I knew there'd be a trick. Is it easier if I speak without it? Can you hear if I speak without it? Okay, alright. I'll just use a big voice. Does that work?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just speak loudly. So just to talk to you about Their World and what it was set out to achieve. You know, at the beginning I was moved to set up a charity because of something that happened to me, and I think that happens a lot for people, where you're moved to act because something happens to you. You can bowl through life quite happily when everything's going well, but when something goes wrong, those are the moments where we often reflect and notice how hard it can be for other people. For me and for Gordon, it was the worst thing in the world happening. To lose a child is the worst thing. I know that. But we looked and strived for something good to come out of that. And at the beginning, we were looking at understanding why there were difficulties with pregnancy, with childbirth, with premature babies, what was needed there. And so that was the starting point for Their World for us, was to say, what I understood, or what we came to understand out of that, is we were not alone. I had 13,000 letters sent to me because what happened to us was so public, that I had the opportunity to read lovely messages from people who were supportive, but also heartbreaking stories from people for whom they'd had that sort of loss for themselves. They'd lost a baby through late-term pregnancy, in the early days of childbirth, and what was the kind of common thread that came for it was, one, to learn that it's a loss you live with inside yourself all of your life, and it just forms part of who you are and how you work. It never goes away. So when someone wrote to me saying, I lost my baby 50 years before, but it's still there, I knew at the beginning of my journey that too would be the same for me. But the other thing I learnt was the number of people that didn't know why it had happened. You know what's happened, but doctors can't tell you why it's happened. So it was the mysteries that made we want to act, to do something that changed that. And that's why we set up the Jennifer Brown Research Laboratory. That's why we've worked raising funds, putting in support, building a cohort of scientists who are amazing and have done extraordinary work. And over these last 15 years, through their work and the collaborations they've had with other scientists, because none of these people do their work on their own, and we've always supported those connections with other groups, other universities, not just around Scotland and around Britain, but also with the universities around the world. That body of knowledge, I look back to our situation 15 years ago, and I can see how much has changed. I see how many circumstances are so different, and babies who are born very early have a much better chance now of surviving and thriving and not going through life with some of the injuries and some of the learning difficulties that otherwise they might have faced. But as of course with all these things, there's still so much more to do. And so what we were committing to this week, with our kind of next step forward, is a big longitudinal study where we're studying with the goodwill of parents of premature babies, a big cohort study, looking at babies who've been tracked from before they were born and right through up to their early years and through their school years. And we know that sort of study yields such extraordinary new insights and amazing revelations of understanding it over a long period of time. So because we've created something and it's grown and it exists, we now feel confident that we can commit ourselves right into the future to make sure that we're studying a group of, it'll be 400, they're babies and toddlers now, but 400 children going forward. And so I hope that will yield, great new knowledge that again will transform the lives of babies and children who would otherwise have had either no start at all or a more vulnerable and a more vulnerable start and a difficult life. So that's been that piece. But of course, whatever you start, it never stays in one place. So it's grown from there. So we've had different community projects around the UK, and then we started reaching out with Their World and doing global work. I have to tell you that when the charity started, it was actually called Piggy Bank Kids, which is a nice little cute name for a little cute charity, and I know Rotarians have supported Piggy Bank Kids in different places over the years. But when we came to do global work, there's no easy way to say this, the pig was not a great That doesn't work. So the pig had to ago, and we worked with a branding company who created this wonderful name and image for us, and these wonderful, the colours of it I really, really love. So we've become their world, and we very much believe it is about going forward to those future generations, and it is their world that we're creating. So our work has taken us to look at where children and young people have been, are at their most vulnerable, and where we think we can do something to help. And we don't want to work alone as a charity. What we like to do is to do the piece that we can do, which is the change piece. We're great campaigners, we're great policymakers, we're great at coming up with innovative projects, small projects that test something out and see if it works. And then when something is working, we take it to the bigger UNICEFs and Save the Children's and Plan Internationals, and they can roll it out. What we've noticed with the big charities is they can't take risks. They're not like a company where you have an R&D department and you just try something out. All the money you give to those big charities, they have to do with it exactly what they've told you they'll do with it. They immediately have to put it to work with something tried and tested that will roll out a feeding program, an education program, a health program, and it's got to work from day one. But that's great because that will reach the greatest numbers, but you need to have something that learns and tests things and tries something new. And that's where their world fits into the picture, is we're the people that very cautiously, very carefully try out small projects, see how they work. When something works, we take it further, and when it's really working, we slot it into those bigger charities. So I'll give you a couple of examples and I'll relate it to education, particularly because we were talking about Malala Yousafzai and the conversation at the big Rotary conference. So education has been a big abiding passion of ours. I believe that there's no way a child can grow up and fulfill their potential if they haven't had a good education or the chance to be able to do that. You can't do that without the chance to go to school and really learn. And around the world there are tens of millions of children who miss out on that opportunity. Now at their world we can't fix that on our own, but we can do the thing that we do, which is look at unlocking different ways to work things. So we developed a program called Safe Schools, and what we've done is look at where you have schools around the world that are at risk, they're under threat, there's a war zone, there's particularly for girls, that vulnerability where they won't be allowed to go to school. So we were very active, we moved very quickly in the wake of the Nigerian girls who were abducted, the Chibok girls, and we created a Safe Schools initiative with the Nigerian government. We brought in funding, we created an initiative that actually had £30 million in it that mapped out how girls could continue to stay at school in the wake of that abduction. What we couldn't do was solve that problem with those girls, other than join in with our voices and calling to bring back our girls, and we certainly did that. But overnight, every parent who had their daughter at school in that whole part of North East Asia didn't send their girls to school anymore. The school's just emptied of girls. And as a parent, all of us would have done the same thing. We would have, if you thought your daughter was at risk going to school, there's no way you would put her at that risk. But it also stopped those girls learning. And the instances of planned early marriage started to go up, girls staying at home to do the chores, girls with their future cut off, the hope that they would have had for their future cut off for them. So what we did was move with a plan where we worked with the Nigerian government, with Nigerian businesses, with UNICEF, with all kinds of groups to create a plan. And what we found out was there were a number of people around the world, but tucked away in academic institutions, who actually had looked at this quite a lot. We didn't need to reinvent the wheel, no pun intended. We didn't need to kind of decide that we were immediately experts on how education in emergencies. What we found was there were people who'd actually studied this. So we brought them together, we created a report, we put that into action in Nigeria. Nigeria now faces terrible new issues with the starvation issues and the famine in the northeast, but the schools have been rather doggedly working away, and also have become quite a useful point for the feeding program, humanitarian feeding programs in the face of that crisis there. So then also turning to the Middle East with the crisis in Syria, their world was the first group that had published a report that we took to the UN that said, here's an idea for how you can solve the problem of hundreds of thousands of refugees pouring into the countries surrounding Syria, where families are desperate to get out, desperate to find a point of safety and to settle. And the idea came very simply from one person who'd had a conversation, and we tuned in and listened to it, and who was running a think tank at the time, the Overseas Development Institute, who said, what about that thing they do with overcrowding at some of the Latin American schools where you run 2 shifts? So you have one school building, but you can put one lot of kids in starting a bit earlier in the day and a second lot in the afternoon. This didn't exist as a way of operating. It's out now quite a normal way of doing things. It's called the double shift school system. But it was their world that published that report, and we moved very, very fast, and we took it into UN meetings using the opportunity that we can get into those meetings and know some of those people. And bit by bit, over the last few years, this has become a very, very normal scheme for doing it, and it's a very good example of how we're able to work using the skills and contacts and expertise that we have, but then turn in something that's now a rolling program. So, working with other groups, we've been able to, and Gordon's now working as the UN Education Envoy, serving the new Secretary General, and looking at making sure that they unlock the big level funding that's needed to make that happen. But when we face the difficulties, the complexities of understanding in our country how to balance the refugees we might host in this country with what we think we can manage and what our own British people are prepared to do and want to do, actually, rather than have a family take the desperate step of getting on a boat and risk losing their lives trying to reach a point of safety, when they're able to find a place to settle in Lebanon or Jordan or Turkey, the countries surrounding Syria, if those families can settle and have just enough money to bring in enough work and enough money for their family to survive, but also, crucially, every parent will tell you the thing that makes the difference is they want the children to go to school. It's that feeling of you just want your children to have that better chance than you've had. So the double shift schools are a really big part of that, and we have a large part of our work is there, some of it in Africa, of looking at just how to keep looking at new innovations and new ways of doing it. So Lebanon now, it's now the Lebanese government now runs that system and looks at different funding that comes in, and they run a lot of it themselves. And you've also got Syrian teachers, of course, are part of the refugee population, so it's another way of balancing out the problem that you've got. So those are probably 2 examples of ways that we've worked using that beginning point of innovation of trying to unlock what needs to happen and then working really closely with lots of groups to make it happen. And the World at School movement that we created has got a lot of young people in it. We have a cohort of global youth ambassadors, we have about 1,000 of them, who each link to community groups around the world. And then we have a wider group who gathered and collected over 10 million signatures for a petition that was taken to the United Nations just calling for every child to have the chance to go to school. So that mobilization piece of creating change by showing there are enough people that want something to happen is another crucial part of it, where you can have the great ideas and you can put them into action, but they won't really settle in or embed unless there are enough people around who show that they want it to happen. So I always say that when you get those petitions coming around, or you get asked to sign up to something, people often shrug their shoulders and say, I don't think that makes much of a difference. But actually, if you don't show what things you care about and you don't give a shout out to those things, then no one can know that you care about something. So I've been on the receiving end, of the other side, where the petitions arrive, and the more names there are on it, the more you'll see a politician or a leader pay attention to it. So never ignore the small petitions if it's something that you care about, is what I would say. And then out of all of this, I think girls, of course, are the most at-risk groups. And at International Women's Day, we have a very good opportunity to just focus in on girls and the hurdles that they face in being able to go to school, to be able to stay at school, to be able to be the people who can become the breadwinners in their families. And early marriage is still such a huge problem around the world. The issue of child labour for both girls and boys is a huge barrier to be able to have a better future. And of course the harder issues around trafficking and the vulnerability of children is another issue to fight. So I know we all feel very overwhelmed with everything that needs to change and need to happen. And the world at the moment looks like it's much more politically precarious in so many different ways, and the number of conflicts there are around the world. But I think if each of us are doing the thing that we can do and that we can make a difference with, and shouting out for something, supporting something, donating to something, I think that's what creates the goodwill around the world. And I think where we're strong about shouting out for some of these complicated issues, where girls need better protection of their rights and better opportunities for their future, I'm so glad that we still have this International Women's Day, and that women and men will take that seriously. And when you hear people going, what about having a men's day? It's like every other day of the year is Men's Day, right? So I think it's fantastic that as a Rotary group you've chosen this as your theme for this year and your focus, and I'm really grateful that you chose me to come along and address you. Thank you very much. I had asked my assistant to send a video. I have no idea what video she sent. Shall we take a look and then I'll tell you? Oh, she hasn't sent it.
She hasn't sent it to us.
Okay, I haven't got a video for you.
Oh well, that's okay.
I'm really sorry there's no video. But if you are interested in looking at some of our films, they're all online under Their World. So there is a huge amount of things that are there. And the Better Angels podcast that I started doing is, what I realised was that I was going to so many different places and meeting some quite extraordinary people who were trying to make a difference in the world. And then other conversations I have, people say, oh, I just think we all have to make a difference, or I'd like to make a difference, what do I do? And particularly young people, who, if I'm interviewing them for a job or something, there's that constant refrain of wanting to make a difference. So that's why I started interviewing them, and I've put it out on a podcast using Abraham Lincoln's great expression about Better Angels as my title for it. So I've talked to Grasa Michel and Kailash Satyarthi and various Nobel Prize winners, but I've also talked to young activists and people that wouldn't necessarily be famous, but you realise they're doing quite extraordinary things. So if anyone's going out for a nice walk with the dog, it's quite a nice thing to listen to. I'm very happy to answer questions if anyone's got anything that they want to ask me.
Want to ask a question? I would like to ask how scary you get when you go to some of these war zone areas. I mean, your own safety, how do you cope with that?
Well, I think it's a judgment call where I certainly have always said to the people that work with our team that they must never go anywhere that they're worried about. And people do come and say, I'm not comfortable going to that part of it. One of the rules we have at home is Gordon and I will never go to a place together. So if he's going, I will go nowhere near it, and that's our house rule. So on the whole, he goes to more scary areas than I do, truth be told. And he's quite fearless about that sort of thing. I remember even when he was at number 10, he'd gone off to go and visit the soldiers in Afghanistan and had wanted to understand what they were experiencing. And so they said, oh, come and stay the night with us. And he slept in one of these sort of tin huts in the middle of the war zone, but they didn't tell me till afterwards. I hadn't done that. But so, yeah, there is a fear. The thing that I've always been more scared of is not so much going somewhere that feels unnerving. It's been this thing of standing up and talking to people. And that's been the thing that I've been most afraid of for so many years. Now I don't mind doing it. I'll talk about things. But at the beginning, I was terrible.
Anyone else?
See, I presume one of the scariest places that Gordon goes to is Starch Park.
Sticks in the home end. He is loyal to Wraith Rovers.
Oh yes.
Yeah. So we seem to have raised a small Manchester City fan in our house, so we don't quite. But I think it's compensating. That's where the goals happen, isn't it? Whereas less so at Starch Park.
Can I just ask, I mean, do you have a sort of organisation that you can rely on? How does it work, I mean, in terms of administration and things?
Yeah, so Gordon and I, when we left government, as anyone does, you're on your own to kind of do those things. And Gordon's not a member of Parliament now, which is always a very separate part because you're looking after a particular constituency. So for us, we resolved it by deciding that Gordon goes and does a number of speaking engagements where he raises a certain amount of money for that, and that goes into a pot, which we then use to make sure that we run him and his ongoing work, which means that all the work that he can do with the UN or with anything else he wants to come behind, Scotland is obviously a great passion of his too, we can support that ongoing work and make it self-financing for us. And then the charity is the charity, so it's separate from us, so we wouldn't have anything with that. But the charity's actually grown to quite a size, so we have, Gordon's not actually involved in it, other than our rule is with the running costs of his office, is when we get to the end of the year, whatever's left gets made over as a donation to the charity, so we've done quite well after that. Years. But then there's also been other supporters for that work. And the charity now, we have a big office in London, we have a big office in New York, we have people in Abu Dhabi and in Beirut and in Nigeria and in 3 countries in East Africa. So it really has grown to some size. I think during the time that we were in Downing Street, it was a fairly modest charity doing the work for the Jennifer Bell Research Lab and a number of community projects. But I always wanted to be very cautious about the way I worked with it, because I felt I had a responsibility to literally any other charity. And my approach to living inside Downing Street was to make sure that black door got open for as many different groups around the country doing different things as was possible. And that was the role I gave myself, as well as some of the campaigning sides with maternal health and some of the causes that I championed. So afterwards, I was able to put that time into their world, and of course I've got an amazing team of people there, and so yeah, it just keeps growing.
Good. Well done.
Yeah, thanks for asking that.
Sarah, are you still in touch with Malala?
Malala is just finishing up her school. She stays in Birmingham, which was why she was able to come and speak at the big conference. So she's had a few years of being very much on the international stage. We got to know Malala because it was Gordon that took action to bring her to the UK originally, and thankfully she was able to receive the medical care she received at the hospital in Birmingham. The reason she went to Birmingham is because that's where our hospital is that treats the soldiers that come from Afghanistan who are injured. So the same expertise, tragically, was needed for Malala as was needed for our soldiers, which it was a gunshot injury. So that's where our medical experts were. And because she was able to get there, they were able to act quickly enough. And she's had a remarkable recovery. She's been a great advocate for girls' education, but also, crucially, continuing her own studies too. The other thing was that on that bus, there were actually 3 of them that day. There was Shazia and Kainat with her 2 school friends, and they were also injured, although less severely. Shazia was injured quite badly in the arm, and Kainat sustained an injury too. And they didn't come across in the first instance, so they weren't caught in that big glare of publicity that no one quite expected, but really took off. And but we had followed up with them too afterwards, and they were really struggling because their village was under such threat again, and they weren't able to go to school, and they were kept indoors, and they were suffering the shock and the after effects. And one of the only upsides to Malala's injury was that she was out. She didn't know what's happened, so she's never had to suffer those ones. But these 2 had kind of got every detail. Anyway, they came across. There was a scholarship arranged for them to continue their studies, and they've been at the Atlantic College in Wales as a boarding, and they've been able to go home every year. Poor Malala's not been able to go back to her country since that moment. But anyway, they also are graduating this summer and just done their university applications, and they're very determined to go to university in Scotland. So they're just waiting on their offers to come through, which I think I think they've done so well with their studies. I think they will be able to do that. So. I think that, and what's interesting is that they've all stayed as dedicated to change and to campaign, talking up for other girls. So, yeah. Hi.
As a person who's just outside Rotary but heavily involved internationally with charities, what do you see Rotary can do internationally?
Well,
like the end of our End Polio Now campaign will hopefully end some year.
Fingers crossed, that would be an amazing achievement. I think it's been phenomenal that Rotary have picked their cause for it. I've spoken to some of the people from is it Evanston, Chicago, and there's that exploration of looking for what the right campaign is, because it needs to suit everybody and fit with everybody. And obviously I've pitched in and said I think education is a common theme where people could work in a devoted way to it, but could also do it in their own way. People can still find different causes in different parts of the world, because I just think that's the one common area where we're within sight of being able to be successful. 5 years ago, education just wasn't discussed at all. I mean, I come from a campaigning health background, and if you look at the amount of funding that's available for health, in part thanks to the Gates and Warren Buffetts who funded the polio campaign so generously, but there's a kind of disproportionate amount that goes into health than goes into education, and yet the cost of education is so inexpensive. I mean, it's small hundreds of dollars per year for a child in Africa to be able to get a whole year's schooling, but what they'll return back to their country's economy is so much greater. So it seems to me that as a kind of core theme for the world, where we look at young people who are really disenfranchised, really restless, really, they don't know what they can do in the future because they haven't got enough, they haven't got the skills to take themselves forward. And we see that across North Africa, we see it in the Middle East, we're seeing it through the United States now. I think that investment into our children with an education, I think has to be at the core of it. And I will keep banging on about it, but it's because I think it's also what will create the people who are the experts in health, who are the experts in, it will lead to everything else. But that core at the beginning, where we've neglected to educate so many children, will only raise adults who won't know what it is they can offer and are fairly shiftless and fairly rootless.
Yeah.
What do you think can be done to improve the education of most youngsters in the United Kingdom today?
Well, I think greater investment into education. I think if I look at, my children are in the Scottish system at the moment, and I look at the curriculum at the moment, I think a lot of it's around expectations, but also about the resources. So I think our investment in teachers and the choices that teachers can make. I think you can see it just shifting a bit where it's...
But how to bring that about?
Oh, I think you have to go to the centre of government and demand centre of government do it, because that's where it's done both in Westminster and in Edinburgh. I don't want to be too political, really, really delicate as I answer that question, but I think you've got to look at who the people are who make the decisions, and that's where you end up having to go, because all of us can work with an individual school and make sure they're well supported, same as we can work with an individual charity, but the greatest change you can make is you look at where the decisions are made. You have to go back to that centre.
One more?
A couple of years ago you represented with Comic Relief and you saw what you did, was it in Ghana or...
Yeah, I went and visited the very north of Ghana, yeah.
But on a lighter note, how much fun did you have in the kitchen and how competitive really?
No, I went and visited Ghana and went there, but Emma Freud, who's the director of Comic Relief, is a very good friend of mine, and she had gone at me for years and years and years saying, come and do something, come and do something. And then Gordon had gone and done a comedy sketch with Gordon that had hit home, and so they kept saying, now you've got to pick something. So I picked the Bake Off Challenge, really, at the urging of my 10-year-old. And yeah, again, it was a massive, massive learning curve. I mean, I had really fun people to work with. I had David, who did I have? I had Michael Sheen cooking away, and David Mitchell. So they were fantastic, it was just very good fun, and it didn't, well, you thought it didn't matter who won. Michael Sheen thought differently. But also just being inside that environment of filming, and I just learned an enormous amount. But really, it's the privilege of being in that tent and the actual Mary Berry and the actual ballroom. Yeah, it was fun. You good?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. Can I now ask Brian Deal to give the vote of thanks on behalf of us? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here on the same extended platform as some well-known speakers.
Thanks, Graham.
International Women's Day recognises the important role that women play in the world.